The first letter they mailed me said I owed $60,000 for buying a piece of land. And for a few seconds, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of joke. I remember looking over at my wife, Emily, holding that envelope in one hand and my coffee in the other, waiting for her to laugh with me. Except she didn't. She read it twice, looked back up, and quietly asked, "Can they even do that?" I wish I could tell you I knew the answer right then, but the truth is, I had absolutely no idea. We had spent almost 15 years building a quiet life outside a little lakeside community near northern Arkansas, far enough from the city that mornings still sounded like birds instead of traffic, yet close enough that I could drive into town whenever one of my engineering clients needed me. We weren't wealthy people, just comfortable enough to finally buy the little strip of hardwood forest next to our property when old Mr. Halbrook decided to retire and move closer to his grandchildren. It wasn't a huge piece of land, barely half an acre, but it stretched all the way to the water, and for the first time since we'd moved there, nobody would ever be able to build a house between us and the lake. That was the entire reason I bought it. I wasn't planning a cabin, a dock, or some fancy vacation rental. Honestly, I wanted the opposite. I wanted the trees to stay exactly where they were. I wanted deer to keep wandering through every evening, and I wanted my future grandkids to throw rocks into the water the same way my daughter used to before she left for college. Apparently, that simple dream bothered someone a whole lot more than I realized. About 3 days after the county recorded the deed, I noticed a dark blue luxury SUV parked across the road from my driveway. The driver never got out. He just sat there with the window cracked, talking on his phone while staring toward my property. Emily noticed him too. "Friend of yours?" she joked. "Not unless I forgot lending him money," I answered. The SUV disappeared after a few minutes, but over the next week it kept coming back, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes creeping slowly along the shoulder like someone inspecting every inch of the land. Eventually, I learned the driver was Randall Pierce, president of the Homeowners Association. Around the neighborhood, people described him with the same careful smile people use when they don't want to start gossip, but secretly hope you ask another question. "He's involved," one neighbor told me. Another simply laughed and said, "You'll meet Randall eventually." Everybody does. They weren't wrong. The envelope arrived the following Monday. Thick paper, expensive printing, bright red letters across the top that read "Notice of Community Violation." Underneath that came words I'd never seen put together before: improper acquisition of protected community property. I actually read that sentence out loud because it sounded ridiculous. Protected community property? The land wasn't community property. It had been privately owned for decades. I had a warranty deed, title insurance, county records, the whole package. Still, the letter claimed my purchase threatened the shared character and future planning interests of the subdivision, and unless I voluntarily transferred ownership to an approved community trust, I would immediately begin accumulating penalties totaling $60,000. Not over a year, not over several months. Immediately, Emily leaned against the kitchen counter and whispered, "They're bluffing, right?" I wanted to tell her yes. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the number printed at the bottom of the page. The receptionist transferred me without hesitation. "Randall Pierce," a calm voice answered. "This is Daniel Carter," I said. "I just received the notice saying I somehow violated HOA rules by buying private land. There has to be a mistake." There was a pause. Not the kind where someone checks paperwork, but the kind where they're deciding how much they enjoy the conversation. Finally, he chuckled. "No mistake, Daniel. That parcel has always been understood to remain untouched." "Understood by who?" I asked. "By the community. The community never owned it. Ownership isn't always the whole story." His voice stayed unbelievably relaxed, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "You should think carefully before making this more difficult than it needs to be." I leaned back in my chair. "I've got the deed sitting right in front of me," he answered with another soft laugh. "Paper has a funny way of losing arguments when enough people decide it should." Then he hung up. I stared at the silent phone for what felt like an hour. I wasn't angry yet, just confused. The whole thing felt absurd, like I'd somehow wandered into somebody else's argument without realizing it. But that night after dinner, while Emily watched television in the next room, I spread every document from our closing across the kitchen table. Deeds, surveys, tax records, county plats. Something about Randall's confidence bothered me. Men who bluff usually talk louder. He hadn't raised his voice once. That meant he either knew something I didn't, or he desperately hoped I would never look closely enough to discover what he was hiding. I didn't know it then. But that stack of paperwork sitting beneath the kitchen light was about to change not only my life, but the future of an entire homeowners association that had spent years believing nobody would ever challenge them. The next morning, I called the county recorder before I even finished my first cup of coffee. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for someone to tell me I'd misunderstood everything. Instead, the woman who answered sounded almost amused when she pulled up my parcel. "Everything recorded clean," she said. "No disputes. No restrictions beyond the standard county ordinances." I hesitated before asking the question that had been rattling around in my head all night. "Does the homeowners association have any authority over that property?" She paused just long enough to read a few more lines, then answered in the kind of matter-of-fact voice government employees use when they're reading facts instead of opinions. "According to our records, no. That parcel sits outside the subdivision boundaries established when the HOA incorporated." Hung up and just sat there staring through the kitchen window toward the trees. Relief washed over me for maybe 10 seconds before another thought replaced it. If the answer was that simple, why had Randall sounded so confident? Men don't usually bluff with that much certainty unless they've gotten away with it before. That question stayed with me all day. Instead of going back to work, I drove to the county archives, a quiet brick building that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. Most people probably imagine legal research as something dramatic from television, but in real life it's slow, dusty, and surprisingly boring. Until one tiny sentence changes everything. I spent hours flipping through subdivision maps, incorporation filings, planning commission minutes, amendments that nobody had probably read in 20 years. Every now and then, an older clerk would point me toward another shelf with a sympathetic smile, as if she'd watched plenty of ordinary people wander into extraordinary problems before. By late afternoon, I had a notebook full of dates, parcel numbers, and references that barely made sense together. Then I found an amendment attached to the original development approval. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't bold. It occupied less than half a page near the back of the file. But buried inside was one sentence explaining that the association's enforcement authority extended only to lots formally annexed into the community by recorded instrument. My newly purchased woodland had never been annexed. Not accidentally. Not partially. Never. I read that paragraph 3 times before asking the archivist to make certified copies. Driving home that evening, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Randall almost certainly knew this document existed, which meant the notices weren't based on a misunderstanding. They were based on the assumption that nobody would ever challenge him. Emily listened quietly while I spread the copies across the dining table. "So, they're wrong?" she asked. "Legally?" I nodded. "Completely." She smiled for the first time in days. "Then this is over." I wish it had been. 2 mornings later, another envelope arrived. The fines had doubled. There was also a warning that failure to comply could result in civil collection proceedings. I laughed when I read it, but it wasn't because it was funny. It was because I suddenly understood what kind of person Randall really was. Facts weren't changing his strategy because his strategy had never depended on facts. It depended on intimidation. That Saturday, the association held its monthly board meeting at the clubhouse overlooking the marina. I'd never attended one before. Honestly, I'd avoided HOA politics for years because life is short enough without volunteering for unnecessary arguments. This time I walked in carrying a thick black binder. Conversations around the room slowed as people noticed me. Randall stood near the front chatting with 2 board members before finally turning in my direction with the same polished smile he'd worn on the phone. "Daniel," he called loudly enough for everyone to hear. I was beginning to think you'd come to your senses. A few nervous laughs floated through the room. I smiled back. Actually, I came to ask a couple questions. Happy to answer them. Great. First one. I opened the binder and laid a certified plat map on the table. Can you point out exactly where your jurisdiction crosses onto my property? His smile barely moved. Community authority isn't always represented by lines on paper. Funny, I replied, because the county seems to think it is. A few heads turned toward the documents. Randall folded his arms. You're misunderstanding the intent of the governing documents. No, I answered calmly, sliding another certified record toward him. I think I'm reading them. The room became noticeably quieter. One of the older homeowners adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to study the map. Another board member whispered something to Randall that I couldn't hear. He ignored her. Even if your interpretation were correct, he said, the board retains discretionary authority to protect the character of the community. I couldn't help smiling. Show me where it says that. Silence. Go ahead, I continued. Page number is fine. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for another stack of papers, pretending to search while everyone watched. That's when something unexpected happened. A woman sitting near the back slowly raised her hand. I'd seen her around the neighborhood but never learned her name. Can I ask something? She said. Randall nodded stiffly. My son owns the wooded lot behind ours, she continued. You've been fining him for the last 2 years over a storage shed. Is his property outside the boundary too? Nobody spoke. Another homeowner chimed in before Randall could respond. Then another. Suddenly, stories started spilling across the room. A fence violation, boat storage fines, landscaping penalties. Somebody mentioned a trail maintained with association money that crossed privately owned acreage. Until that moment, I believed I was alone. I wasn't. I had simply become the first person stubborn enough to bring documents instead of fear. The meeting dissolved into overlapping conversations as board members tried unsuccessfully to regain control. Randall finally slammed his hand on the table. This discussion is over. Actually, I said quietly, gathering my papers. I think it's just getting started. 3 days later, 2 county vehicles rolled into the subdivision just after 9 in the morning. One belonged to zoning enforcement. The other carried investigators from the county compliance office. I hadn't called them anonymously. I filed a formal complaint under my own name, attached certified copies of every document I'd found, and asked only one thing: verify the facts. They spent nearly a week examining financial records, maintenance contracts, easement maps, and property boundaries. Neighbors watched from porches while survey crews marked corners most of us had never paid attention to before. Rumors spread faster than summer storms. Some insisted the county would find nothing. Others whispered that the board had been operating outside its authority for years. I stayed out of the conversations. There wasn't anything left for me to argue. The paperwork was speaking for itself. And for the first time since that ridiculous $60,000 letter landed in my mailbox, I realized I wasn't trying to beat Randall anymore. I was simply waiting for the truth to catch up with him. The county's official report was released on a rainy Thursday afternoon, and somehow the news reached half the neighborhood before it reached me. I was outside replacing a sprinkler head that had cracked during the summer heat when my phone started vibrating over and over again in my pocket. At first I ignored it, figuring it was another client calling about work. But after the 5th call, Emily stepped onto the porch holding her own phone with an expression I hadn't seen in weeks. She wasn't smiling because we'd won. She was smiling because, for the first time in months, she knew we weren't crazy. Daniel, she said quietly, you need to read this. I wiped the dirt from my hands, opened my email, and stared at the county letter. The first page alone made my heart pound. Then I kept reading and reading. Every paragraph felt like another weight lifting off my shoulders. Investigators confirmed that the Homeowners Association had repeatedly enforced restrictions on properties that legally fell outside its jurisdiction. They documented improper violation notices, unauthorized maintenance on privately owned land, and enforcement practices that exceeded the authority granted under the association's own governing documents. None of it was based on my opinion. None of it depended on who told the better story. It was all there in black and white, supported by surveys, recorded plats, financial records, and county filings. The report recommended immediate suspension of all enforcement actions involving affected parcels while additional legal review took place, and homeowners who had paid certain fines would have the opportunity to seek reimbursement. I just stood there in the backyard holding my phone while rain slowly soaked through my shirt. I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, I was exhausted. Fighting somebody who refuses to admit they're wrong is a strange kind of fatigue. It isn't just the meetings or the paperwork. It's waking up every morning wondering what the next letter will say, whether another neighbor believes the rumors, whether you're somehow missing something obvious. For months, Randall had counted on that feeling. He expected fear to wear me down long before facts ever had the chance to catch up. Instead, the facts showed up first. Within 2 days, the subdivision looked completely different. Neighbors who had barely spoken beyond polite waves suddenly gathered at the mailbox kiosks comparing old violation letters, laughing at things that certainly hadn't been funny when they happened. One older couple admitted they'd paid thousands of dollars in landscaping penalties simply because they couldn't afford to hire an attorney. Another family confessed they'd abandoned plans to build a workshop after the board convinced them it violated rules that, according to the county, never applied to their lot in the first place. I kept thinking about how many people had quietly folded those letters, written the checks, and assumed the board must know something they didn't. That realization bothered me more than my own case ever had. A week later, the association held an emergency meeting. This time, I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to leave the entire mess behind and enjoy the peace we'd fought so hard to get back. Emily squeezed my hand before I walked out the door. "Go," she said. "Not because you need to prove anything, because everyone deserves to hear the truth in the same room where the lies started." She was right. The clubhouse felt completely different from the last meeting. The confidence was gone. Board members spoke in careful voices. Homeowners asked direct questions without looking over their shoulders first. Then, halfway through the meeting, Randall stood up. For just a second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to apologize. Instead, he cleared his throat and read a short, prepared statement about changing priorities and allowing new leadership to move the association forward. That was it. No acknowledgement of the people who had spent months worrying about impossible fines. No apology to families who paid money they never owed. No admission that he counted on intimidation more than authority. When he finished reading, he gathered his folder, nodded politely, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the doorway, he stopped beside me for just a moment. Without looking directly at me, he said, almost under his breath, "You made things difficult." I looked back at him and answered as calmly as I could. "No, Randall, the documents did. I just read them." He didn't respond. He simply walked outside and disappeared into the parking lot. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. A month later, the association elected an entirely new board. They hired independent legal counsel, reviewed every policy, and began posting financial reports where every homeowner could actually read them. Meetings became surprisingly uneventful, and funny enough, that might have been the healthiest sign of all. Good leadership rarely makes headlines. It just quietly does its job. As for our little stretch of woodland, we never changed our original plans. The trees stayed exactly where they'd always been. We cleared only enough brush to create a narrow walking trail leading to the lake. And on cool evenings, Emily and I still carry 2 old folding chairs down to the limestone bluff to watch the sun disappear behind the water. Sometimes we don't say much at all. After everything that happened, silence feels different now. It doesn't feel uncertain anymore. It feels earned. Every now and then, someone driving through the neighborhood slows down to admire the trees and asks if we're ever going to build something there. I always smile and tell them the same thing. The view was the whole reason we bought it. They usually nod and keep driving, never realizing how much that simple sentence means to me. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about half an acre of land. It wasn't even about an HOA. It was about what happens when ordinary people start believing that confidence automatically equals authority. I'd always assumed that if someone spoke loudly enough, wore the right title, or mailed enough official-looking letters, they probably knew the rules better than I did. That assumption almost cost me something I legally owned. The truth is, power without accountability grows comfortable, and comfortable power eventually stops expecting anyone to ask questions. Sometimes the most important thing an ordinary person can do isn't win an argument, it's simply refuse to stop asking for proof. That's all I ever did. I asked questions, read every page I could find, and trusted facts more than fear. In the end, I didn't tear down the HOA. I didn't embarrass anybody in court. I didn't get revenge the way people imagine revenge in movies. I simply held up a mirror and let the truth do the rest. And honestly, I sleep a whole lot better knowing it happened that way. Now I'd love to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, would you have fought all the way to the end? Or would you have paid the fine just to make the problem disappear? More importantly, do you think Randall truly believed he was protecting the neighborhood? Or had the power simply gone to his head after too many years without anyone challenging him? Share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments, because stories like this remind us that communities work best when rules apply equally to everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for spending your time with me today, and until next time, take care of yourselves. Stand your ground when the facts are on your side, and never be afraid to read the fine print.